Hi, thanks for checking out my first mini painting video. I'm definitely still in the stage of learning and getting comfortable with making these videos, but I hope you bear with me as I stumble through it. In this video I'll be painting Misa the Samurai from one of the extra Guards of Atlantis II hero packs, and my aim is to paint this mini to a fairly high tabletop standard, but to provide a few stopping points along the way where you can choose to be done painting the mini. I plan to paint all of the Guards of Atlantis minis this way, and my goal is to make painting these minis feel approachable and achievable, even if you don't consider yourself to be an expert painter. I know that painting minis can seem daunting, but after you get the initial colors blocked in, you can put the brush down and stop at any point in the process. If you follow along with these videos, I encourage you to push just 1 or 2 steps further than you did the last time, but it's totally okay to call the mini done at any point. And with that preamble aside, now we'll move on to painting. First things first, I'll go over the model preparation and priming. I won't go into detail explaining every step and technique along the way, but I'll link some useful resources in the description. The model has some pretty pronounced mold lines that'll stand out if we don't clean them up, but obviously this step is completely optional. If you don't feel comfortable with this process, or you simply don't want to spend time on removing mold lines, that's totally okay. If you want to take care of them, the most prominent mold lines are this one running down the chest and then down the right leg, one running across the top of the wing armor, and one running down the outer side of each leg. I clean most of them up by just scraping them aggressively with my hobby knife, and I don't do a perfect job with these, but I try and at least make them less noticeable. Then I prime the model in dark gray. I do this with an airbrush, but a gray or a black rattle can will also work just fine. Just taking a quick detour for my airbrush to get clogged, and then we're good to keep priming. Again, don't worry if you don't have an airbrush for this step. I'd probably actually prefer rattle can priming these models since there's so many to paint in the Guards of Atlantis box, but it's winter in Minnesota and my airbrush is here and was already set up. Then I make a zenithal gradient by spraying the model from above with a very light gray. As a side note, you can absolutely do this with a rattle can or just by heavily dry brushing light gray. It's not a big deal if you don't have an airbrush for this. I've actually done a side-by-side test on a couple of minis shown on screen, where one is zenithally highlighted with an airbrush and one is just done with a dry brush. And as you can see, the difference is minimal. It's really just a matter of convenience and convention. And after that, I take a big dry brush and I dry brush the whole mini with a pure white, making sure that I catch the feathers pretty well with this. Again, if any of these steps are things you haven't been exposed to before, there are some links down in the description of useful resources. For this dry brushing, I'm using a pretty large makeup brush, which I find to work really well for dry brushing with some nice stiff bristles. And I make sure that almost all of the paint is off of the brush, but I brush pretty heavily, and mostly this is in a downwards direction. But you can see that, especially on the wings, sometimes I'll just kind of jam the brush side to side really quickly for a really heavy dry brush to make those wings feathers stand out. Alright, so before anything else, I paint all of the gold details and armor trim using Pro Acryl Rich Gold. I do this unthinned straight from the pot. I'm doing this first because I'm going over all of the armor later with contrast paint, which will naturally also shade down this trim in the same step. This model has a lot of gold trim, so this is one of the most time-intensive parts, and it's fine if you accidentally get some gold paint where it doesn't belong. If it's just a tiny bit, just ignore it since the next steps will hide it well enough, but if it's a big splotch, then just cover it up with any roughly similar light gray color. There's no need to be really exact when trying to color match this. If the gold paint you're using has bad coverage, either do a couple coats or mix in some brown paint to boost the coverage a bit. Luckily though, Pro Acryl Rich Gold is an amazing gold color and it covers really nicely. Hopefully you don't mind that I'm not showing every single bit of these steps. This video would last forever with lots of blank space if I just showed me painting trim for like half an hour. So instead I'll just show enough that you roughly probably get the picture of what I'm doing in each step. And then it's on to speed paints for the rest of the model. I start with the wings because they're the biggest and most obvious part, and I'm painting the bottom halves of the wings with pure Grim Black, and I mix Cloudburst Blue and a little bit of Speed Paint Medium with some Grim Black to paint on the upper parts of the wings. I also use the pure Grim Black kind of underneath where the swords are on the front of the wings, since that's the area that I think will have the most shadow cast on it. I load up a lot of paint on my brush when I do these steps, and the two wet speed paint colors will naturally mix together to make a pretty seamless transition. You can mess around with blending these two colors a bit with your brush like I do, since the speed paints are very forgiving with blends like this. But again, if this isn't something you're comfortable with, you can just skip it and move on. Even though I want the wings to be perceived as a black color like in the reference art, I'm adding a little bit of blue into it to make it look more interesting than just a flat black color. Next up is all of the armor. I mix up a roughly equal mix of Grim Black and Hive Dweller Purple, and again I thin this down with a little bit of medium. I load quite a bit of this onto my brush and I douse the armor panels in this. I also put this all over the gold trim at the same time, and this will work as sort of a heavy shade for the gold trim as well as settle nicely into the recesses to hide any of those small areas where we were a bit sloppy with the application of the gold. I try to be pretty neat with these speed paint applications, and you can use a brush with a little bit of water in it to clean up any areas where you get speed paint somewhere unintended. At this point I noticed a couple areas that I didn't realize were armor panels as well, so I quickly painted the gold trim and the purple armor on those the same way. Then the talons, the weirdly actual human hair looking hair, and the hands all get Grim Black. The headdress thing and the arm and leg cloths get Fire Giant Orange. The belt gets thinned down dark wood. And the stone thing on the base gets Gravelord Gray. While I'm blocking in the initial colors, I also get started on the base. I use two colors, Vallejo Model Color Khaki and P3 Moldy Ochre, because these colors seem to both match pretty closely to the colors of the zones in the game board. Here's just a quick comparison of what they look like on the palette versus on the board. I thin them both down with a bit of water and apply each of these colors to one side of the base in a couple of coats, letting the wet paint get mixed together in the middle a bit. That way the base will look pretty close to the board in most of the zones color-wise. You can also just pick one color or another if you don't want to be as cutesy with this as I was, and in that case I would recommend picking the khaki color. Finally, I paint the katana blades black. You can definitely just paint them any sort of steel or silver color you'd like, but I thought it'd be fun to try making them a sort of shiny onyx color. I mess with this a lot later, but for now they'll just stay like this. And here's our first stopping point. The colors are all blocked in and it looks pretty good overall. If you don't want to spend a lot of time on each of your guards heroes, or you don't want to mess with dry brushing and highlighting techniques and extra shading, you can just stop here and have a great looking mini that will still look perfect on the board. But the next few steps are pretty quick and really elevate the look of the model, so I encourage you to try them out. The next steps are all about adding quick visual interest and pop to the Mini. So first I take a light blue and I dry brush it over the wings. I believe in this case I'm using Pro Acryl Gray Blue. I wipe almost all of the paint off the brush to make sure this applies nice and smooth. In the video I'm just showing random bits and pieces of this dry brushing step, but I'm doing this pretty heavily all over the wings, trying to get a pretty pronounced light blue highlight look on the edges of all the feathers. I also revisit some of these areas multiple times if I notice that one part of the wings doesn't look like it's gotten quite enough highlight. And after that, the wings looked good before, but they look pretty awesome now. Optionally, you can then follow this up with a second dry brush, this time mixing in some white into that light blue to get a pretty bright look on the feathers. I should also note here that I'm making the wings look a little bit more bluish than blackish at this point, and although I think the card art is really good, I'm doing this just because as an actual miniature on a board game table, I want this to have a little bit more contrast and emphasis on the wings. At this point, this is a bit of a lighter dry brush, and I also decide to dry brush the claws this color as well, just because I feel like they need a little bit of contrast too. Then I dry brush an off-white Pro Acryl Ivory all over the stone statue thing and the base. In retrospect, this was a bit too much of a cold white for my taste, and I'd choose a color that looks more like a tan or a bright yellow. Oh, and I also decide that this color is suitable enough, so I use it to dry brush the hair and the belt while I'm at it. Then I take some pure white and run it along the edges of the sword for a really quick edge highlight. I use the side of my brush to do this, and I try to keep it fairly neat. If you're doing a metallic color on the sword blades instead, just replace the white color with a bright silver or a steel color. This next part will test your brush control a little bit. Mix a generous amount of silver or a chrome color in with the Pro Acryl Rich Gold, or whatever gold you chose to use, and highlight all of the gold trim. You don't have to do this on every panel edge, but I recommend at least doing this on the tops and upward facing edges of the wing and armor panels, as well as on the shoulders and on the head, and in general on any of those areas kind of around the face and wings and arms area. I also use this color to clean up where the dry brushing from earlier covered up the gold. You can stop this process whenever you'd like, or take it as far as you have patience for. Here you can see I'm also working on highlighting the gold trim around the legs, even around the back where you're not really going to be seeing too much of that armor. So would I recommend doing all of the highlighting that I do for this? No, probably not. And now we're already at the second good stopping point. Now we've added some pop and contrast to the model, and now it definitely stands out a lot more. Here's a comparison between the first stopping point and this one to see what a difference these quick steps make. From here on out is where I start to use some more advanced techniques and pay more attention to the small details. If you're following along, you can put down your brush at any point. The rest is just some extra sauce on the side. The armor is still looking a little bit flat, so I use some P3 Bad Bruise mixed with Frostbite to highlight it up in a few thin layers. I don't fuss too much about getting super smooth blends, mostly because that isn't really the style I prefer to paint with anyway. I move on to mixing a warm brown with an orange to highlight up the cloth, working towards pure orange, and then adding in a bit of Vallejo Ivory to really push those highlights brighter. Then, while I've got those colors on the palette, I add a little bit of warm sienna color into the ivory and do a really quick highlight along the rope belt. Then I take a quick detour to shade the base with Agrex Earthshade, and then while that's drying, I get to work on the elephant at the desk, the swords. I intend for these to look like a shiny onyx sort of color, but in the process I kind of end up making a bit more of a non-metallic metal meets lightsaber look. But honestly, I don't mind. I think after some back and forth work, they look pretty cool. If I was doing this over again, I'd just paint them with a really dark metallic color to make a black metal effect, but this felt like fun practice too. I didn't really have a clear process or plan in mind when I was messing with the swords. I just took Pro Acryl Coal Black and their Bold Titanium White and just kind of mixed them together into various light and dark grays, and just kind of made rough blends between the two. I also added in some of the P3 Bad Bruise, the really dark purple that was on my palette, and mixed that in a little bit for some quick glazes at the end, just to add a little bit more interest to the color than just a pure black to white gradient. With that out of the way, I glaze a little bit more of that P3 Bad Bruise into the recesses in the armor panels as well, just to get a little bit more depth and color in there. I didn't have any issues with the speed paint reactivating here, although I did wait like a day and a half or so before coming back to do this, so that was probably enough time for it to cure for long enough. I decide the feathers can get a bit of sporadic highlighting with a brush too. I mix in a bit of white to the light blue from before. I wick almost all of the paint from my brush just to make sure I don't flood any of the paint into the crevices between the feathers, and I try to keep this last highlight pretty subtle. Then, now that the wash and the base is dry, I dry brush it with moldy ochre again to try and get back some of that yellow, warmer color. I paint the base rim black, and then that's it. And here's the finished mini. I hope this demonstrates that you can get some really cool results on this model with some time and attention to detail, but zooming out a bit, there's very little difference in what you would see when you're actually playing the board game around the table. Don't feel like you have to paint it to the level that I did just because I wanted to try hard and put a lot of time into it. I guarantee that if you show me a Guards of Atlantis mini that you painted, no matter how you think you did, I will think that it looks awesome. I plan to start working on the base game heroes now, and I'll probably scale back the level of effort that I put into these just because I've realized how many minis there are left to go in this game. But let me know if there's a specific hero that you want me to make a guide for, and I'll do that next. I hope you liked the video, and I hope you have a great rest of the day.